and who recently has started as director of our Jewish Cultural School. So Rabbi Jeremy was ordained as a rabbi from the International Institute for Secular Humanist Judaism. He has a BA and MA in religion from Florida State University, where he majored in Jewish studies, and then a law degree from Indiana University. So to quote Rabbi Jeremy, becoming a rabbi was a long, strange journey. He taught Jewish topics to children and adults. For some time, he was in IT and a quality systems manager. He was a staff attorney for an appellate court judge. And he taught undergrad and grad students, law students, at Indiana University Business School. He is also the president of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and on the boards of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, as well as the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. So I'm betting you learned a few things about Rabbi Jeremy there. And to help us understand the convoluted scene of Israeli politics and the recent changes, I'm really pleased to have him update us on this topic. So big thank you, Rabbi, and over to you.
Okay. It sounds really impressive to be the president of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis until you realize that we've got like 15 members and I'm president because nobody else wanted to do it. So I feel like I should just kind of qualify that. This is not a prestige position. This is one of those ones where everyone else walked backwards. So recent developments in Israeli politics, as you know, there was an election, that the voting happened in March, all of these other things happened in the interim. So we've got a lot of questions that we could ask and answer. And everybody's going to have a different opinion and a different analysis. You'll see fairly quickly the direction I think we ought to start going when thinking about Israeli political issues. So we'll talk about what happened in the wake of the 2021 election, or at least the March 2021 election. The die is not cast that there won't be another one this year. How did the latest mini war with Hamas affect any of this, if at all? How did the COVID-19 epidemic play a role in any of this, if at all? And what's happening right now, or last week? And what does it mean for the new governing coalition? So more specifically, we'll talk about what parties are in the coalition and why it matters. It's a weird governing coalition when you look at it on the surface, and it's a weird governing coalition when you dig into it too. So we should ask, what's the future going to be for this? What are its challenges? Can it actually sustain itself? What is the actual left-right nature of the Israeli electorate? I don't know about what you grew up with or were given as messaging throughout most of your life, but the messaging that I grew up with was Israel is really a left-leaning country. It's very secular. It has all these welfare state things, and really it's almost socialist. Like, that was the presentation that we were given, and remained the presentation that we were given through college and into adulthood for a while. And I'll tell you, I think that that's the wrong way to look at Israeli politics. And that to the extent that as American Jews, that's the view we have of Israeli politics, we're pretty wrong. What's happening with COVID-19, especially the Delta variant, and what's the nature of the messaging disconnect? We'll talk about what's going on with how the Delta variant is being talked about by the Ministry of Health and how the press is talking about it, because it's not the same. And what's happening with Israel and other nations, right? This Abraham Accords, the Iran deal, whether it exists or not anymore, right? There's lots of things to talk about. So, we should talk about where we were when we got to the election in March. So, this time last year, more or less, a new governing coalition had set up effective May 17th that was supposed to do a number of things: limit Netanyahu to 18 months as prime minister. Benny Gantz, who was the chair of the Blue and White Party, was going to serve the next 18 months. And Gantz would become prime minister automatically if there were elections called within 6 months of the government's formation. So the idea was, okay, well, Netanyahu, if you try to pull the thing that you keep pulling over and over again, where you call for elections in order to stay in office, you're going to have to step down. And that coalition ultimately was a very broad coalition, right? It had the far right religious United Torah Judaism Party, which is Haredi, largely Haredi and Ashkenazi, right? So Eastern European origin, Haredi, ultra Orthodox Jews, and all the way out to the center left Labor Party, right? So that's a really broad coalition. And that happened in large part because Israel was in one of its three COVID-19 spikes last year. And this was pretty early on, so the number of deaths was still fairly low, all things considered. Confirmed cases were still fairly low, but everybody could see what was happening. And that seems to have made Gantz, who was poised to form a government last year, made Gantz kind of sign up with Netanyahu and say, unity right now, dealing with the pandemic, is more important than all of these other things. So that's what we're going to do. So that's where we were a year ago. All of that is kind of important for understanding how Netanyahu made the argument that he should be elected prime minister, and is important for sort of understanding how different the structure of government looks now. So, putting the March 2021 results in context, right? What happened? Where did we get there? How did we get there? What does it look like? And I want to put us in a 40-year context. So 1974. 45, 46? How old am I? I'm 44, so 46-year context. So this is what the government looked like. Who was the prime minister since 1974? And if you add it all up, you discover that there's about 32 years of Likud prime ministers and about 11 years of Labor prime ministers. This is not exactly what you would call left-leaning governance, right? Few years here and there of Labor plus a whole lot of Likud. And more and more and more and more years of right-leaning governance as time went on. So, Ehud Olmert made it 3 years, but Ariel Sharon was there 5. Ehud Barak was there 2, but Netanyahu was there 3, right? The larger numbers are there for the Likud prime ministers and not the Labor prime ministers. And you can see Netanyahu was in office 12 years the second time around, 15 years total as prime minister. So it's a long time. And I point this out because we so often function with there's a strong left idea in Israel. And that's just not borne out by election results year after year after year after year. It just doesn't pan out that way now. Everybody's left compared to, in most respects, where we are in the US, but that doesn't mean that makes Israeli politics left-leaning politics in a strong way any longer. So this is the result. This is the March 2021 election result. This is 2020. This is 2019, the second election in 2019, right? We've been doing a lot of elections recently in Israel. And you can see that Likud still wins the largest number of seats. 30 seats in 2021, 36 in 2020, 32 in 2019, and then the other parties, blue and white, so this Kahol Lavan party, which is pretty centrist, gets a large number of votes until it splits up. And then you've got a lot of parties that get 9, 7, 6 seats. Yesh Atid, which was part of blue and white the last couple of years, is its own separate thing again. And so we kind of have to split these numbers out, but you can see that went from 33 to 25. So we're not seeing a trend leftward, really. So we're seeing something else. We've got a lot of smaller, mostly right wing or far right parties, right? Shas is kind of far right. United Torah Judaism is far right. Israeli Home is center right to right. Yamina is right, right? There's a bunch of right wing parties, and there's not a lot of left wing parties anymore. So, just in terms of number of parties and then the nature of the votes as they come out overall, this is a heavily skewed toward the right and a little toward the center, and not so much toward the left anymore, which is really a huge change, right? The Labor Party really led Israel all the way into 1977 almost, right? So Rabin was prime minister from 74 to 77. This is a lot of left wing governance that all of a sudden is not so left wing. So Will asked what's left and what's right, and we'll get there because I'm going to describe the parties for us in a minute. Items of note in the results: Likud is still the largest single party, and it's still chaired by Benjamin Netanyahu. So this phenomenon that we're kind of accustomed to in politics, where you lost the last election, therefore you don't get to be in charge of the party anymore, has not panned out for Netanyahu. Also hasn't panned out for a certain former president of the United States. So there's some stuff to talk about there. Naftali Bennett, who is this fellow over here, in case you've never seen him from that angle before. Naftali Bennett is now prime minister, and he is talking to Mansour Abbas, who is the leader of a right-wing Islamic party, and really was the person who made Bennett prime minister. And we'll talk about how that happened too. So you'll see he's wearing a very small kippah. We won't go into the politics and nature of kippot in Israel because kippot means something depending on their shape and size. We won't go too far into that, but you can see Naftali Bennett wears a kippah all the time. So he's a little bit different from every prime minister before him who would slip the kippah on at certain opportunities and then take it off the rest of the time. We looked at these numbers and I said there's not a lot in the way of left-wing parties. So center right to far right holds a combined 72 seats in the Knesset. The Knesset has 120 seats. Centrist parties that might flirt left or right, so we're thinking of left and right in particular ways that aren't the same as in Israeli politics, and we'll get to what that is. The centrist parties that might flirt left or right have about 25 seats. Right? These parties that say, no, we're trying to pull together two different pieces of things, right? These centrist parties tend to be very strong on defense issues and a little more strong on secular and secularization kinds of issues. So they are the parties that most often tend to oppose more funding for religious schools and want to see more people from the Haredi community going into the IDF. So that's where kind of the centrist parties land. They have 25 seats out of 120. Arab parties, so there's a left-wing one that's really socialist and communist and labor-oriented. That's the joint list. And then Ra'am, this right-wing party, they hold 10 seats. So the real left-wing Jewish parties, Labor and Meretz, these historically left-wing, labor Zionist, pretty socialist, Meretz quite socialist, these parties only hold 13 seats. So the left-wing Jewish parties only hold 13 seats. Centrists hold 25 seats. 72 of the seats are right wing parties, starting with Likud, which is kind of a center right party, but in some ways is a little centrist, in some ways is a little not, right? 72 seats from the center right to the far right. And by far right, we're talking far right people who think, you know what, Israel should cross into Jordan, right? There are those folks, and they belong on the Israeli right. That's 72 seats. So we keep thinking of Israeli politics, and we keep thinking of the peace process, and we, in our heads, sort of divide parties up left or right based on peace process and some of these other issues. First of all, that's not really the divide in Israel, but second of all, look, they skew right in a way that we don't necessarily always appreciate clearly in the US. Why is there such a small left? You know, demography tells you a lot. More than 70% of Israelis living today were born in Israel. In 2015, 44% of them had fathers who were born in Israel. So a lot of the immigration has stopped or has really slowed down. There are all kinds of articles about how immigration has gotten very strange due to COVID and a number of other things. This means that 70% of these of current Israelis were born in Israel, which means that they actually have a political consciousness that's separate from European immigrant origins of their now grandparents and great grandparents and great great grandparents, right? These people, these labor Zionists who came and they were on the political left and they were into labor and they were into creating social welfare structures and all of that stuff. Those people are, many of them, gone. These are their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, their great great grandchildren. And they have their own political consciousness that's connected to a country that opened up into more of a market economy. And their political commitments are not the same. And then the largest sources of immigrants since 1980 have been the former Soviet bloc. A lot, a lot, a lot, a lot of former Soviet bloc Jews are secularists and they're right wingers, which is something that is less common in the US but is quite common in Israel. Or they come from Middle Eastern and North African countries. That's the MENA there, right? The Middle East and North Africa, who had bad experiences with Arab persecution and poor treatment by the Israeli government after they came, right? So this is the people make Aliyah, and they come from these Middle Eastern countries, and they get put into the desert in the south, and they're told to lose their accents, and they're told to look different, and they're told to get better jobs and don't sound like you're from Yemen anymore. And right, this sounds like a kind of common immigrant story. It was left-wing governments telling them all of that. So they didn't do terribly well with the left wing. And their experiences with Arab persecution give them a different perspective on Arab Israeli issues than secularists who came to Israel from Europe. So this is a different political consciousness. It's not the same as what came before 20, 30, 40 years ago. And on most economic policy issues, the Israeli right is still left even of the UK's right wing. So, you know, the religious left, the religious right still wants social welfare stuff. They just want it for them. But everybody is still largely in agreement that you should fund schools. Everybody's still largely in agreement that you need a national healthcare system that functions in a way that we don't have that agreement here in the US, right? We all know that we don't have that agreement here in the US, that our right wing doesn't think people should necessarily have public access to healthcare. Just making sure we're sure. Okay. So their right and our right are different. So who's in our coalition now? Yamina. So this is Naftali Bennett's party. He's the new prime minister. Yamina is a Hebrew word that literally means rightward. I don't know any other way to put it. This is a right wing party, right? This is a party that has um, market economic kinds of policies in mind. Naftali Bennett made his money in the tech industry. It's right wing leaning. It's comfortable for modern Orthodox. That's the small kippah that Naftali Bennett wears. To some degree, for rightward leaning secular Israelis. To some extent, Israeli religious Zionists. So a lot of right versus left is not organized completely around economic issues the way we think of them, and there's more on defense and more on foreign policy issues and some other questions that orient left and right a little bit more. Whereas in the US, left and right is very much tied to what do you think the economy should be like? Yisrael Beitenu, Israel is our home. Avigdor Lieberman, secular Jewish hard right, heavily Russian, right? This is the one party that has a Russian name along with its Hebrew and English names. So its Russian name is Nashdom Israel. Our Israel is our home. So this is one of these guys who thinks that Israel should be the current state within the Green Line and all of the stuff, Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And if you were to give him a little bit into Lebanon and a little bit into Jordan, he wouldn't cry. This is Avigdor Lieberman and Yisrael Beitenu. So Tikva Chadasha, New Hope. This is Gidon Sar, who was Attorney General in one go around or Justice Minister in one go around. Sort of centrist, sort of right wing. They have a strong defense orientation, but they also have sort of an interesting, almost federalist way of looking at things. That they want more local control of political issues. Still some populist political spending. Not a hardcore market economic party. Again, this is a right wing party, but not right in our terms. Kachol V'Lavan, blue and white. This is Benny Gantz, who was the former Israeli, the chief of the IDF. Largely secular, centrist, rightward tilt on defense and Palestinian and Arab issues. So Benny Gantz ran for prime minister the first go around, and the opening ad for his campaign was the body count ad, which I don't know if you've ever seen, but Google it. Benny Gantz body count. And basically it was a running number of the Palestinians in Gaza who were killed during not the most recent, but the one before in 2014, that Benny Gantz was the Israeli military's chief of staff. So this was him running on a strong defense platform. Look how many people I killed. So economically, kind of in the middle, but right leaning on defense. Yesh Atid, there is a future. So this is led by Yair Lapid, who is a very handsome, very well-spoken, very educated guy, newscaster. His father was involved in politics. Largely secular, center left, but not really leftist, right? There's a connection to this market economy stuff. Not quite as far to the right on defense as blue and white, but they're close enough that they made natural allies the last few elections. So these are your kind of centrist parties. Ha'avodah, Maflagat Ha'avodah. So this is the Labor Party that used to run Israel for the most part for, its first 3 decades. Center left and labor Zionist. Stronger defense positions than the left, not a hardcore leftist group economically, but not a right-wing group in any respect. Meretz, Vigor, so they actually are the only major Jewish political party that has an Arabic language name, and it's just Meretz in modern standard Arabic. They're left-wing, and they're Zionists, so this is labor Zionism and farther left, but they're starting to show signs of decoupling from Zionism. They're little tiny indications that maybe they're going to drop talking about Zionism from this document or that document, but it hasn't really happened yet. But it's starting to there's starting to be a little bit of talk. And the last member of the coalition, the surprising one, the really surprising one, as though, a party called Rightward and the Socialist Jewish Party were not strange bedfellows already, is this party Ra'am. Ra'am in Hebrew means thunder, but it's an acronym of Harishima Ha'aravit Ha'mu'chedet, the United Arab List. Politically, they're led by Mansour Abbas. Politically, you're talking about a party that, in a lot of respects, is not too far off from the Islamic Brotherhood in some respects. They are off to the right. Politically, social conservatism, and Islamic. And they are now in the governing coalition. They don't have any, they have one cabinet official, right? They're not pulling a lot of weight, but they were the last four votes needed to create a government. So if they walk away from the governing coalition, the government falls apart and there are elections again. So there's some interest in keeping them happy. So this is the governing coalition, starting with a party that says rightward and with Yisrael Beitenu all the way out to Meretz on the left, and then this rightward leaning Islamist oriented party that joined the coalition. And we'll talk about why, because there's a great interview with Mansour Abbas in Time magazine that explains a lot of what happened on his end. So this is the governing coalition by one seat, right? Not a big majority. So what's the deal with Ra'am, this right-wing Islamist party in the government, and not the left-leaning joint list? So if you haven't read it yet, Time's profile on Mansour Abbas is really interesting. And it explains, historically, Jewish Zionist parties don't make alliances with Arab parties, even if it means they won't be able to form a government, seeing it as compromising the Jewish nature of the state, right? So a year ago, more or less, in April 2020, Benny Gantz, who ran a campaign to oust Netanyahu, ended up joining him in government after he got cold feet about depending upon Arab parties. Lots of Israeli politicians run on the platform of their party, and they also say, if I'm prime minister, we're not going to make deals with the Arab parties. Abbas says, look, that was a defining moment because I realized I didn't have friends on the left. It was then that the idea struck him to reach out not to the left, but to the powerful yet fractured right wing. I'm willing to collaborate with the whole spectrum, and that's how he opened options and wide doors to Arab politics in the Knesset. He didn't make a deal with the left, he made a deal with the right. His politics, in a lot of respects, the social policies on LGBTQ issues, on support by the government for religious bodies, is really quite right wing. And so actually his positions make a lot of sense, right? We have that sort of discussion that happens in the US about, are evangelicals really all that different from Islamists? Are they really that different from ultra-Orthodox Jews? Politically, not really. Doctrinally, yes, but politically, not all that different. And so the irony is Netanyahu is the one who opened the door for the four votes that Abbas brought with him, the four seats that Abbas brought with him in the Knesset to oust Netanyahu. It was Netanyahu who for years incited against Arab citizens and leaders who offered Abbas a hand in April 2019 because he wanted to break up the joint list. So these Arab parties that held, depending on the year, 10 to 15 seats, he wanted to break them up because he needed 4 Knesset seats to form a coalition. They talked. Nothing really came to fruition, but they talked about resources to deal with crime and violence and lack of housing. And that didn't produce a government, but Abbas says, aha, I can make a deal with the right, which seems very unlikely for a party that says, look, maybe we're not all that cool with Israel existing, right? Ram as a party is associated with a two-state solution, but what your two-state solution looks like depends on who you talk to. So Abbas says, oh, there you go. If I can work with the right wing, then yeah, you can do it with the left wing too. Each one of these parties that joined the coalition joined with a different set of conditions. The condition that Abbas joined with was not restart the Oslo process. It was, look, for the first year, no more social experimentation for LGBTQ people. That was one of his red line policies. Not Israel and Palestine stuff, but no more moving society to the left, please. No more LGBTQ friendly laws, please. Let's stop that. That was what he wanted as a condition for joining the government. So, again, what's he got in common with the people on the right? Religious predispositions. But the irony is, his 4 seats, Ram's 4 seats, were the 4 seats that toppled Netanyahu this year. And Netanyahu's the one who brought him into government. Because Netanyahu was the mentor for all of these right-wing politicians who he then turned on. And eventually, you can only make so many enemies. And that's probably really what we're talking about here. Who's out? Likud. Single largest party by seats in the Knesset, is not in government. United Torah Judaism, far right religious party, not in the government. Shas, which is far right religious in Lardi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi. So Mizrahi is other parts of the Middle East. Mixed attitude toward the state of Israel for both of these religious parties because they're not really Zionist. The left-wing Arab parties in the joint list are nominally in the opposition, but they're not exactly common allies with these other parties. And then the religious Zionist party, 6 seats. These are all the people that Netanyahu, not including the joint list, these are the people Netanyahu had been able to make deals with. And it was always a question of which of these other right-wing or centrist parties can I make a deal with to form a government. He couldn't make a deal work this time. So these are an odd sort of opposition on the right to a government that's also largely run on the right. So this is not what we imagine American politics to be like, right? We sort of at least nominally identify the Democratic Party as a left-wing party, but what do you mean by left-wing? I know. So we largely identify the Democratic Party as leftward leaning somehow, and the Republican Party is rightward leaning, and we think left right on a particular set of issues. That's not how it works. But a lot of what's happening in terms of government in Israel is really on the right, a little bit on the center, not really on the left. So it's a little odd to see all these right-wing parties fighting with each other. It's worth noting, this is just in the last couple of weeks that this has happened, that Ruvi Rivlin, who had been, pardon my spelling error, Ruvi Rivlin, who had been president, was replaced by Yitzhak Herzog, whose nickname is Bougie. Poor guy can't drop this nickname no matter how hard he tries, who was leader of the Labour Party until a couple of years ago. This is kind of like the Queen of England. It's a ceremonial role, but this is the person who dissolves the Knesset, right? So yeah, there's somebody from Labour in the position of president, but that doesn't drive government. And it's nice to know that Bougie is still employed doing something, I guess, because he kept losing elections. So that's sort of the lay of the land on the party politics stuff, right? So really, it's a heavily right-leaning government with a little bit toward the center and a little less toward the left. The first prime minister of this governing coalition is Naftali Bennett, who is very much on the right. The kingmaker, as it were, is a right-wing Arab party. This is a very strange bunch of people to be in coalition together, unless the one thing you really want to do is get Benjamin Netanyahu out of the prime minister's office, in which case you do whatever you can, which is kind of what happened here. So it's worth talking about where Netanyahu took some of Israeli politics, not policy, but politics. And this is a not so funny thing happening on the way to the forum. American political consultants are playing an increasingly large role in Israeli politics, especially on the right. There was talk about a Democratic pollster working for Kahol Lavan or one of these centrist parties, but American political consultants are working with right-wing Israeli parties. So Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu, has had Corey Lewandowski. This is the guy who said womp womp about people with disabilities on national TV. That's that guy. Corey Lewandowski, David Bossie, and Aaron Klein, who all worked for Trump at some point, advised Likud. The Lincoln Project was advising Gideon Sa'ar, right? So this centrist, center-right, sort of federalist kind of a party. There's a lot of American GOP aligned, more or less, operatives who are working with Israeli right wing parties. Netanyahu spent 15 years as PM, as prime minister, and more than 22 years since the mid 90s. He spent 22 years as chair of the Likud party. So this is like being president for 15 years and running the Republican Party for 22. Likud is very much Netanyahu's party right now. And they are existing in some very strange, very familiar seeming bubble. Yair Netanyahu is Benjamin Netanyahu's eldest son, went on American media and claimed that Naftali Bennett, whose party is called Yamina, rightward, claims that Naftali Bennett is a puppet of the left on One American News Network. So, right, One America is one of these news outlets that opened up and is making its money on being farther to the right than Fox. He went on American conservative media and said, that right-wing politician who walks around and has a kippah on his head all the time, that guy's a leftist. Everything is weird in politics everywhere. And we know Netanyahu courted American evangelicals as early as 1998. There's an LA Times article talking about how he courted American evangelicals because he wasn't getting a lot of traction with the Clinton administration. And American evangelicals have remained largely sympathetic to Netanyahu. There are even some of these guys who have been saying that this is a second crucifixion, that he's God's elect for Israel the way Trump was God's elect for America. Right? This is where Netanyahu land has gone in a very Trump land kind of direction. So that's a new piece that wasn't part of Israeli politics 4 years ago even. And the Netanyahu government was aligning itself with the right internationally, right? So the Abraham Accords, which were normalizing diplomatic relationships with Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan. These are not exactly your human rights respecting governments. Develop close relationships with Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, right? This is the guy who got COVID-19 and said it wasn't a real thing. And Hungary's Viktor Orban, whose political party is as close to being fascist as you can get without also saying, by the way, we're fascists. Work on the Abraham Accords continues. Yair Lapid's first trip internationally was to the Emirates. Sign another economic deal. Continued assistance on something other than the Iran deal, right? This deal that Obama worked out with Iran and Europe to try to kind of curtail nuclear developments in Iran. The Israeli government still, no, we don't want any part of that. So the foreign policy is remaining consistent and is remaining kind of rightward tilted. That's not going to change too much. Here's how weird things have gotten. If you haven't been tracking it over the last couple of weeks, and I don't know why everybody would be tracking this, but if you haven't been, there's a law, the Citizenship and Entry into Israel law. It has been around since 2003, and the idea is to prevent family unifications that would allow people, Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, from obtaining residency in Israel if they marry an Israeli. And its rationale is always cited as security, security, security. We got to prevent terrorism. So the way you prevent terrorism is by penalizing Israelis and their non Israeli spouses if they live in the West Bank and Gaza. The law was set to expire on July 6th, and the almost entirely right wing Israeli opposition, including Likud, opposed renewing it because Netanyahu's commitment is to bring down Bennett's government. And he argued that toppling the current government is more important than this security law, remembering that Netanyahu ran in many respects as the guy who can keep you safe. This is the beginning. This is the breaking point. He's willing to oppose a law that he favored in order to be able to undo the governing coalition. And the result was a 59-59 vote. The law was not renewed. So currently, the citizenship and entry into Israel law is not on the books in Israel. Why would he do this? There's always been this sort of, okay, Netanyahu thinks he's the government, right? L'État c'est moi, right? The state is me. You could chalk it up to that, but actually he knows that this is a law it's safe to oppose right now. The law grew out of the Interior Ministry making decisions anyway, so this is just legislative enactment of administrative policy. His Interior Ministry can still keep these folks out, so they will. So it's safe from his political perspective to oppose this law. The government will just restart the process of renewing the law, so okay. The Israeli court, the Supreme Court of Israel, just refused to address the nation-state law from several years ago, so what are they going to do on a citizenship law? Which they had already affirmed in the past. Netanyahu knows it's safe to take an issue that all the right-wingers care about and throw it to the side because actually politically it works right now for him. So again, this is all, or heavily, infighting among right-wing and right-leaning parties. This is not left-leaning, left and right kinds of politics the way we are accustomed to thinking about politics, even in Israel. Right? Our heads often automatically go left, right, and that's not what's happening anymore. So I said we talk about Gaza and the coronavirus, and you can tell I've tucked them to the end. And I've tucked them to the end for a reason. What about it? This mini war in Gaza happened after the election occurred, didn't change the outcome of coalition formation, as far as anybody can tell. Everybody says they won, which means nobody won. None of the facts on the ground were changed by any of this. So what about Gaza? People died. That's what happened in Gaza. It was not, again, productive as a political anything. Did COVID-19 have an effect? Netanyahu ran on saving everybody from COVID-19. Didn't work for him. He ran on a combined message of, I got you the vaccine early, and we're going to need more vaccines, and only I can ensure you get them. Didn't work. The Delta variant that we're dealing with now, that's now. The election happened in March. The coalition formed in June. It's July. So, again, people were killed by COVID-19. People got sick. People were disabled. It seems to have had no obvious effect on Israeli politics in the sense that we're talking about right now. What about now? COVID-19 infections spiked over the last week plus, just like they have in the US. The Ministry of Health says the Pfizer vaccine that we got everybody, it doesn't seem to be really preventing enough of these infections. They say it's 64% effective at prevention, 93% effective at hospitalization and severe symptoms. The government, the Ministry of Health, is starting to talk about buying more doses of the Pfizer vaccine to provide boosters. Israeli public health experts keep pointing to the unvaccinated folks over the age of 50, many of whom are Haredi, right-wing religious folks, who won't get vaccinated, and saying we just need more people vaccinated. Pfizer is using the Israeli data as a basis for seeking FDA approval for a booster program. The CDC and the NIH are also saying we need more people vaccinated now, not so much with the boosters. So the Ministry of Health is saying one thing, health experts are saying another. And there was a dust up in the last couple of weeks about Yediot Achronot, which was one of the Israeli media outlets, was actually saying, you know, the government's goofing around with the numbers here in Israel on hospitalizations for COVID. So there's actually an accusation floating around right now that the Ministry of Health is maybe lying in Israel about who's sick and how many people are sick. So the effectiveness or not of the Pfizer vaccine is sort of not really a known quantity right now, and it's a political football in Israel to the extent that there are political footballs right now, just like it's a question here. And if you look at what's happening in the US, the states that have low vaccination rates are having spikes of COVID-19 more than the states with higher vaccination rates. So there's something to this whole just get vaccinated kind of thing happening. The big takeaway out of all of this is many Machar folks are very J Street type folks. J Street politics is not Israeli politics. J Street politics is American politics, and it's American Jewish politics. It is not so much Israeli politics. We just line up differently. And it's a really big deal that we kind of have to think about Israeli politics in a different framework, particularly if we hope to have any impact on what Israel does on any number of issues, but certainly Israel-Palestine kinds of issues. So that's it for the PowerPoint slides. Actually, sorry, they're keynote slides, but what's the difference? So, Howard, I don't know how you want to moderate around questions, but I do think you have to be unmuted to moderate questions.
You'd think I'd know that by now. Thank you so much for a terrific talk guiding us through this complex landscape. Joyce, well, first of all, Will, I think you'd asked earlier about what's right and left in Israeli politics, and I think Rabbi has clarified how we need to shift our thinking on right versus left. I don't know, Will, did you want to follow up and ask anything further on that issue?
No, I felt like the question got answered as the presentation flowed through, so I've got it now.
Okay. Good. Joyce.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. It did clear up, especially the numbers on the right-wing parties versus. I know I'm not supposed to think about it that way, but still.
No, but you should. We needed to stop and think about it that way for a second, right? To realize that talking left-right is not the right conversation to have.
Yeah, true. So my questions are: I know you said you wouldn't necessarily get into this, but I'm very curious what you said, the offhand remark about yarmulkes and what different ones mean, because I don't know anything about, I haven't heard any, I mean, yarmulkes versus hats, maybe one thing, but.
Right. And
secondly, I'm very confused about this law, a citizenship law. Like it sounds like something somebody like Netanyahu would want, but then he's arguing for the undoing of it. I mean, does he mean, oh, if you let me back in power, I'll put it back in?
Oh, okay.
I'm just very confused about that.
Okay, so let's do the citizenship law, and then we'll worry about Kippot. So the citizenship law came into being in 2003. So because I don't assume that we're all walking around with a complete encyclopedic knowledge of who was prime minister in 2003, it was Ariel Sharon before he undid Likud, left Likud and created Kadima, which doesn't really exist anymore. So this citizenship law is intended to prevent family unifications. It started as a legislative enactment of a policy that was already being enforced by the Interior Ministry. So the Interior Ministry was already in 2002 preventing these kinds of family unifications. Ariel Sharon then got it enacted as a law through the Knesset, but the Interior Ministry never lost the ability to make these determinations on its own. So when you get to 2021 and you have Netanyahu coming up to the edge of saying, I was cheated out of becoming prime minister, and where his son is running around in the press saying, this right-wing prime minister is actually a leftist. If that's your framework, and your job is, as a parliamentary politician, to get the other guy out of office, and you can force a no confidence vote, which is ultimately what you're trying to do, it's safe to oppose this law that you know is just a thing that enshrined an administrative process that existed already. So there's no actual risk to the ability of the government to do this anyway. And in the absence of any risk to the government of being able to use this policy, which is characterized as a security policy, hey, it's then safe to just say, kill it. I'm going to oppose it here because nothing will happen, right? Other than maybe my political adversary is now going to be out of a job, which is really what he wants. So the kippot, right? The yarmulkes and so Netanyahu doesn't wear a kippah except for photo ops. Naftali Bennett, I showed that photo where he has a very small, it's small, knitted kippah. So the kippah that you wear, if you are a kippah wearing person in Israel, tells a lot about your political and religious orientation. So Naftali Bennett wears a kippah sruga, which is a knitted kippah, like a hand-knitted kippah. Those are what we would call in the United States modern Orthodox. Right? It's a thing that you're wearing on your head that says, I'm modern Orthodox. Naftali Bennett's is really small, like unusually small, which indicates that he's on like the modern end of modern Orthodox, which makes sense for him. He's made his money in tech. He was in the same special forces units as Benjamin Netanyahu and Benjamin Netanyahu's brother Yonatan, right? So they have this kind of shared political and military heritage, and it's just that I'm a little from, right? That's what you're saying with the little tiny kippah is, look, I keep Shabbat and I keep kashrut and I follow some of the family purity laws, but I'm not that religious. Black velvet kippot, the big black velvet kippot, as you start to get into that, you're starting to get into Haredim, obviously the hats and the stremels and all of that stuff. At a certain point, it becomes difficult for us to be able to differentiate among Haredi groups. They can tell each other apart at an instant because they're very subtle cues about the hats and about the clothes and all this other stuff. So that's what's going on with Naftali Bennett's kippah. There's also a story. Okay, I got to tell this story because it's kind of funny, I guess. There's an article in, I think it's Times of Israel, but maybe it's Haaretz, the English language edition, that asks the question, how does Naftali Bennett keep his kippah on his head? Because I don't know if you noticed, but that man doesn't have a lot of hair. And it turns out that there was a modern Orthodox Israeli guy who developed something called the kippah keeper. So it's the kippah that Naftali Bennett uses to keep the kippah on his head. However, there have been times where he doesn't have access to that, and in at least one occasion, he is known to have used some chewing gum to stick it up there for a speech on a windy day. So
So what
Not
is
so
the
Bennett's a tech guy.
kippah? Is that like a glue or something?
Yeah, it's a mild adhesive kind of a thing, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rabbi, relatedly, Renee asks, what's the difference between kippot and yarmulkes?
Hebrew and Yiddish.
Okay,
So kippot is Hebrew, yarmulkes is Yiddish. That's it.
thank you. Rick, you're on.
Great, thanks for this wonderful presentation. I have a question about whether people in Israel are frustrated with their political system, a parliamentary system that creates political fragmentation and that results in a government that basically can't do anything. And are there ideas being spread around about alternative systems or modifications of the system to create a more stable government?
Yes. So there are people who are frustrated. If you don't know who this person is, she's a writer for Times of Israel, among other things. Her name is Sarah Tuttle Singer. Sarah Tuttle Singer is an American who moved to Israel a decade or so ago. And she is generally politically sort of on the left mostly. She wrote an article recently where she's a Facebook post actually, where she said, I was taking a cab the other day and the cabbie asked me about my opinion about the government and about Israel-Palestine issues, and I was explaining to him what I thought, and he said, what, even with the Palestinians? I said, yes, even with the Palestinians. Look, you've got to be an optimist to live in Israel, and I'm an optimist. So there's you have to kind of be optimistic to be willing to live in Israel. And function in its politics and to move there from the United States and stay for a decade. So on the one hand, yeah, there's this optimism, but there is discontent with a political system that functions. I don't know if you're familiar with Italian politics, everybody, but this is how Italian politics works too, right? You're not voting, you don't vote for people in the Knesset, you vote for a party. The party puts whoever they want as their slate, and you decide whether you're going to vote for that party. There is frustration with it. Gideon Sa'ar in particular, his party, Tikva Chadasha, New Hope. So Gideon Sa'ar has proposed kind of decentralizing politics a little bit, so creating a little bit more of a federal system, getting money into local government hands as opposed to central government hands. He's also proposed Knesset term limits. So there are some parties that are interested in changing the political structure. Whether that has any legs is, a different question, but there is interest in it.
Thank you. Mark, you're on.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeremy. That's very helpful and insightful. Although I will say there was a glimmer of hope there. If the right wing is having consultations with people like Corey Lewandowski, that could only lead to more disarray among them and all that. So, I think that may be a good strategy for us to pursue. But so I guess my question is somewhat aside from the political parties. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was what always seemed to me be a pretty thriving peace and justice movement in Israel. There were at least a half dozen organizations that were focused on human rights for Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. There was strong push for a two-state solution. Some of this, I think, was related to a stronger Labor Party, and some of it seemed to me to be independent of that. And my sense is for at least a decade now that the strength of that movement is very much diminished. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts, and is my understanding correct? And if so, is it similar dynamics to the political parties development, or what has caused this decline in support around the country?
It's interesting. So I think demographics plays a large part, right? Who's going into the IDF now? Who's coming out of the IDF? Who's been going in and out of the IDF for the last 40 years? Heavily Sephardi, heavily Mizrahi, heavily secular Russian. and those are just right-wing leaning folks, right? So as the left-wing party's kind of infrastructure has degraded, you lose people from the left. So that's part of it. There are still a lot of organizations doing this kind of work, so it shouldn't be said that they don't exist, but they exist in a much more charged political atmosphere. So you will get, there is an organization called Breaking the Silence, Shomer Shtika. So Shover Shtika. So what does Shover Shtika do? Shover Shtika is an organization made up largely of former IDF officers and enlisted personnel who talk about their stories policing the West Bank and Gaza. And over the years, as they tell their stories more, they are more and more accused of being traitors, which should sound very familiar in American politics, right? There's a kind of a common right-wing trajectory for both Israeli and American politics that's a little spooky. In part, it should be noted, Netanyahu's been PM for a lot of this. Guess where Netanyahu grew up? Anybody want to take a guess if you know?
Outside Philadelphia, right?
Philadelphia. His father was a professor at Dropsy University, which is now part of University of Pennsylvania. His father was a direct advisor to Vladimir Jabotinsky, the guy who created revisionist Zionism, and brings with him an MBA and brings with him American political life. So it's pulled to the right in that way. So those organizations exist. There are maybe even more of them numerically than there once were. So in addition to Breaking the Silence, there's an organization called B'Tselem. They have an amazing interactive historical map on their website that you should go look at just because it's amazing and shows you how the settlements have overtaken much of the West Bank. But they're subject not just to criticism, but to accusations of treachery that didn't happen before. So the entire political environment has changed, and that's weakened their influence level. And it has to be said, look, Rabin died. Rabin was killed. Rabin was killed in large part from right-wing incitement. Guess who was doing the inciting? The former Prime Minister of Israel. So this has been going on. This has been a long-term weakening over like 25 years now. So a reorientation of Israeli politics would probably have to happen to strengthen these organizations, or there just have to be more and more loud ones. Is Peace Now? So Peace Now is around. It's called there's Peace Now and Americans for Peace Now. These are organizations that are still around. Is anybody effective in a parliamentary system? I don't know. That's a different question.
Thank you. Jack?
Thanks. At the end of your talk, you pointed out that given the now entrenched rightward nature of Israeli politics, that a traditional left-leaning organization like J Street has little influence. So what are the next 4 slides that you haven't done yet? Meaning, how do leftward Maharnik types in the US have any influence on what you have described?
That's a lot harder, right?
That's why you didn't do the slides. Yeah, I know.
That's why I didn't do the slides, among other things, right? But also because it was an Israeli politics update, not an American politics update. So I have to tell you, the day that I got my second COVID-19 shot, so this is back in March, I went to the big mass vax site at Six Flags, and it was a 2.5 hour long line, so I had some time, so I was on a J Street phone call. And Jeremy Ben-Ami was on it, and it was for clergy. And the discussion was, okay, so what do we do? And they didn't say there's not much we can do right now. However, they did say there's not much we can do right now. And the acknowledgement eventually came on this call, and it was a little shocking. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes. It might not happen in our children's lifetimes. It may be a 60-year process to get things reoriented in a way that might produce some kind of lasting result of some kind of peace process. That's how long J Street is talking about its window now. And it was stunning, because a 60-year thing tells you that there's not much you can do right now other than what you're doing if you've got commitments to J Street, or to If Not Now, or to any of these organizations that are trying to create some change. J Street just basically admitted, this is not a foreseeable future thing, which was a little bit stunning. And I know they said it for sure because it was before I had gotten the shot, so I wasn't having any COVID vaccine effects. This was me sitting in line waiting and hearing, yeah, it's going to be 60 years. So I can't write the slides because J Street can't write the slides either right now.
So Rabbi Nadine asks, what do you mean by some political parties not being Zionist?
Okay, so the discussion on what Zionism is has gotten very strange to me. Because if you look at what Zionism started as an organized set of political ideas, it was not how Zionism is framed a lot of the time now. The way you'll hear people frame Zionism is, don't you believe that Israelis are entitled to security in a set of borders like every other country? That's all we want. That's not historical Zionism. Historical Zionism is, you, diaspora Jews, you are unsafe where you are. Your only source of safety is for there to be a Jewish state in Israel. This is what will make you safe. And it'd be better if you moved there than if you stayed where you are. We cannot wait for the Messiah. We must do it now. That is historical Zionism. There are far-right political parties in Israel who don't share that idea. They say, we live in Israel, this state of Israel, quote unquote state of Israel. This is not Israel. This is not really what we mean when we mean return with the Messiah. They do not support the broad idea that Zionism means a Jewish state ensures Jewish safety in the world. However, they all live there because they couldn't live in Europe anymore, because we know what happened in the 1940s. So many of them ended up in the modern state of Israel and have settled and have gotten roots there and continue to have families there. They don't support the idea of a Jewish state. They don't join the IDF. They're not invested in the Zionist idea. So there are these far-right parties that say, we want social welfare benefits, we want our schools, we want. We are going to study Torah, that's our job. That's it. There are religious Zionist parties who do have this broader political idea as part of their religious beliefs. So that does exist on the political right in Israel, but these far-right religious parties are not expressly Zionist in quite the way Zionism means Zionism. And so that's really the difference, is if they had to move to Hungary tomorrow, they would. Because we're not invested in the state of Israel as an idea. We're not invested in a Jewish state.
So Renee has a question. why don't the Israelis want to share the country with the Palestinians?
Well, it depends on the Israeli, right? So this is an interesting kind of thing to dig into. Um, if you look at polls of Israelis, they tend to say that they do want a two-state solution by thin majorities. But the question you need to ask yourself is, what does that mean? What is a two-state solution? And when you dig into that, and their Brookings Institution has done some focus groups, and when you dig into what that means, it means something different for everyone. So for Israelis, it means we're here, you're there, stay over there. No, you don't get a law of return. You don't get to come back. This is our country. You left. The houses you have keys to don't exist anymore. Stay where you are. You'll have your country, we'll have ours. Stay over there. For many Palestinians, it means there'll be an Israel, there'll be a Palestine, but we get to go back to Israel, to ancestral land. What does that even look like? It's hard to know. The two-state solution vision is different for Israelis and for Palestinians. And there are Israelis who do not want a two-state solution at all. They want the whole chunk of land because this was promised to us by God, if you're a religious Zionist. If you're Avigdor Lieberman, this Russian hard-right secular guy, because Avigdor Lieberman is a Russian hard-right secularist who wants to defund the yeshivas. So he's different still. He's just an ultranationalist. He said, I came from the Soviet Union. We were not safe. We need Israel. We need all of it. So he's not going to share because he doesn't want to share. He doesn't think they should be there. Not because the ancestral promise, but because we need safety, which is really kind of the ultimate revisionist Zionist idea. Safety first, and then we'll worry about democracy. So you've got religious Zionists, you've got folks like Avigdor Lieberman, these ultranationalists. You've got people like Likud who slow walk the thing because actually they're also pretty much revisionist Zionists and they don't really want to share because it's ours and we need to be safe and that's more important than anything else. And then you have people who want to share, but the conditions of the sharing are an issue. The reality is everybody has to be willing to lose. Everybody has to be willing to lose, and nobody wants to lose. So right now, if there aren't enough people who want to lose, whether they're Palestinians or Israelis, there's nowhere to go. Everybody's got to lose.
What about saying everyone could win by giving up a little or something?
Well, you got to be willing to give up. You got to be willing to give up something you really care about in order to get to whatever the next step is, right? Because, look, hey, we'll give up a little piece of desert near a lot. Fine. That's not a thing I mean, come on. That's not really what we mean here. You know, it's like, it really has to be everybody has to suffer a little bit in terms of losing the stuff that they really want to keep in order for everybody to have the bigger thing of peace.
Good. Michael, you're on.
First I want to thank you, Jeremy. This is a perspective that people like us really need to absorb, the fact that there really is no Israeli left of any significance. I've read that the collapse of the Israeli left was greatly accelerated, and in addition to the demographic points you made, greatly accelerated by the Second Intifada, the violence, the bus bombings, where people were just affected and just said that's the end in the early 2000s. I just wondered if you kind of agree with that as an additional reason.
I think that's true. I think what's probably more true is not just the Intifada, but the results of withdrawal from Gaza. Because the idea with the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 was, look, we can't really govern this area. We're out of here. And So we're done. And what happened? Rockets flew in from Gaza. So for somebody walking the street who says, look, we left and look what happened, that seems like persuasive evidence that it doesn't matter. And the other part of it, and I think we understate this aspect of being a regular human being. Israel's economy is better than it has ever been in terms of overall prosperity, even with Gaza being as it is, even with the West Bank being as it is. The high-tech industry is huge. It's a financial center. It's a medical research center. The average Israeli walking the street in Tel Aviv or Haifa or name your place, even in the newer neighborhoods of Jerusalem, it doesn't matter. I can live my life. I serve in the military a little bit, and then I have this career. Or I can move to Berlin for a little while, save up money, and then buy a home when I move back to Israel. And I'm prospering. Remember, it's the economy, stupid? I mean, sure, that's 30 years ago in American politics, but it's the economy, right? If I'm prospering, that issue kind of doesn't matter. So it's not even that they think, oh, it's so terrible, we need to do something. It's, yes, it's terrible, but I'm fine. Indifference is a huge factor in how everybody behaves.
So I have a question which I know is going to sound quite naive, but we often talk about Jewish values, and one might think or hope that Jewish values would play out in the Jewish state. But what does the state of Israeli politics say about so-called Jewish values?
So this is not as naive a question as it sounds, right? So I have a colleague, many of you have met him, Jeff Falick. Rabbi Falick says there's no such thing as Jewish values. Identify a Jewish value that you think is positive, that is truly just Jewish. Not Jewish identity, not Jewish endogamy, not having more Jews, not Jewish, none of that. Identify a thing. Education. Education is very important to Jews and to many, many other people. Peace. Peace is important to everybody. Every major world religion talks about peace. And which version of Jewish values? There's always a tear, always a pull between particularism and universalism. It's in Orthodoxy, it's in humanistic Judaism, it's in conservative Judaism, it's in rabbinic Judaism 2,000 years ago, it's in biblical Judaism 500 years before that. We may have to just deal with the fact that Jewish values are highly contradictory. And it's a question of emphasis and not Jewish values, right? So this is the thing. Have you, if you're Facebook or anything like that, you'll hear people say, I'm sorry, that's not a real Christian. Aren't Christian values charity, blah, 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 blah. That person's not a real Christian. Those right-wing Christians aren't real Christians. And the right-wing Christians say those left-wing Christians aren't real Christians. Maybe we just have to grapple with the fact that they're all really Christians. And we're all really Jews. And we're all just looking at different pieces of the puzzle in different ways. And then it all just becomes really human. And I'm not sure it says anything about Jewish values.
But ultimately, there's so many interpretations and sometimes contradictions. Doesn't it make the term basically meaningless?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
And that makes it very human, right?
So I'm looking I think, does anyone else have a question, a comment? Any hands going up or in the chat box?
Nobody has typed. Nobody has typed. Wow, that was depressing. So,
Howard, there was a question from Nadine that I'm not sure got answered.
I'm sorry if I missed.
You said some of the political parties are not Zionist. Please explain what that means in the present.
Yeah, we did do that. Yeah, we did, Joyce. We did discuss.
Yeah, you feel like we did do that. Okay.
I think so.
All right,
okay.
finally, somebody acknowledged it was depressing. Thank you, Norm.
Okay.
Welcome. And also, I did have another question that was about half an hour ago. It kind of sounded a bit like Jack's, though, but it was a little bit more focused on, because I think his was, anyway. So what strategies are being considered by leftist Jewish groups here or perhaps in Europe to try to influence future shifts in Israeli political dialogue? And then just like freelancing, my thought is like, maybe we should, is there like a reverse birthright program where we take some young Israelis, bring them over here and have them understand American perspectives on politics and approaches that might inform their situation? What's your thoughts?
So on the reverse birthright thing, Israelis come over all the time. But we're not pitching them on being Americans, right? Birthright is about pitching American Jews on maybe being Israeli, at least marrying other Jews, if nothing else, right? So that's kind of what's happening with birthright. In terms of what organizations are doing, so first of all, it should really be said that there is not much of a peace process oriented Jewish community anywhere in Europe. The British Jewish community does not really have a substantial set of organizations the way there is J Street and If Not Now and all that other stuff in the US. True for France as well. There just aren't a lot of left-leaning on Israel issues Jewish organizations in Europe, because if you're willing to identify as Jewish in Europe and you're not an Israeli, well, that says something about you and your willingness to kind of stay the course on a particular way of being Jewish. So there aren't those organizations. At the moment, J Street continues to do what J Street has done, which is to organize citizens to do lobbying, which is what AIPAC does, by the way, too. AIPAC doesn't actually do a lot of direct lobbying itself. It organizes citizens to go do the lobbying. They're doing what they've always done. They try to raise some money. They try to get recognition from broader Jewish community organizations, and they try to lobby. And they're trying community organization things and whatever they can. But we got to face the fact that there are about 6 million American Jews, 7.5 million American Jews, and there's like 60 million evangelical Christians. And I know we don't control the banks, so it's pretty likely that those 60 million evangelical Christians have more money to influence politics than the 7.5 million American Jews have. So all you can do is lobby and organize and work at the local level and kind of hope, because the reality is, look, J Street wasn't admitted into the organization of the presidents of major Jewish organizations. They weren't allowed in. They were submitted to a vote and they were knocked out. Like 25% of people said that Jeremy Ben-Ami could be part of that club. The Workers' Circle is part of that club, but only for historic reasons, right? Society for Humanistic Judaism is not making that club. So I really don't think there are great strategies right now. I think the numbers are against us right now. And that J Street basically said, yeah, it's 60 years. Which, again, it was before I got my shot. So I know they said it.
So
I just wanted to respond to that quickly, if I might.
sure.
And I'm not disagreeing at all, because this is just a drop in the ocean. But about 9 years ago, we had a speaker, a friend of mine, former colleague of the State Department, Todd Deathridge, who spoke here in adult ed. And he is founded an organization called Telos, Telos, which for the most part brings works with brings evangelical Christian groups on tours to Israel and Palestine, to convince them that the current policies are hurting everyone, the settlements, the wall. And he works with these two partners, one Israeli, one Palestinian, who take them on tours, and there are homestays for 2 or 3 weeks. Again, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's really comforting to know somebody who's doing that for that community. They also bring groups from other communities as well. I've proposed are considering him coming back, or someone from his organization coming back this coming year to talk about that. And even post-pandemic, organize, I mean, it's at cost, a Machar community group to go, which he's more than willing to do. So anyway, I just wanted to just put that out there. We'll be discussing this, the adult ed committee will be discussing this tomorrow at our meeting.
Thank you. So it's really time to wrap up, but as a last question, Rabbi Nadine asks, what are good sources of info on the Israeli political scene?
So Israeli journalism isn't quite as obsessed with the idea of impartiality as American journalism is, which means that there's no AP, right? There's no Israeli Associated Press. So what you got to do is read kind of across the spectrum. So routinely, I read a combination of Haaretz, English language Haaretz is fine. You don't have to read the Hebrew. Haaretz, Ynet, which is, I mentioned Yedioth Achronoth earlier, so that's Ynet, ynetnews.com. Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post. If you can really, really stomach it, the English language of Arutz Sheva, which is israelnationalnews.com, which is pretty right-leaning without being religious, also is worth the reading. Arutz Sheva has ties to, among other people, Sheldon Adelson, so that gives you a sense for where they are. And you can actually, if you go to the israelnationalnews.com, you can tell the orientation of the newspaper is different, because the top tags are Iran, IDF, Naftali Bennett, Donald Trump, coronavirus, and Benjamin Netanyahu, as opposed to election, Israel, Palestine, right? So there's a lot to be gleaned from that sort of meta-analysis of what is this channel talking about.
What about the Israel Policy podcast?
I mean, I would say listen to any podcast you can get your hands on.
Yeah, I think it's quite good. Israel Policy podcast. And
so what I would suggest is there is a radio station, TLV1, Tel Aviv 1, right? Channel 1 in Tel Aviv, that has a number of podcasts. They're English language podcasts. They're very good, but it's Tel Aviv. It leans pretty far to the left. There's not a lot of right-wing voices, so it's not quite as balanced. But they do have several, including it's called The Promised Podcast, which is a weekly podcast that has a panel discussion and is, again, primarily left-leaning folks, so you don't get a big right-wing perspective, but they are the last, they view themselves as the last bastion of people who really, really, really believe that everybody wants a two-state solution. And so it's worth following them as well. They're at least funny. They're mostly academics, so they're snarky.
So a few people asked, what can we do? And I think it's a mitzvah to subscribe to the English version of Haaretz. So a little unsolicited plug.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's $12 a month, something like that. It's not.
They always have specials.
Yeah, there's always a special.
Doesn't
It's
it?
like the cable company. There's always a special.
So, Rabbi, thanks so much for, I won't say simplifying, but helping us comprehend this complex situation. So a big, big thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
And keep cool. Okay.
Endeavor, at least.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.